I'm really honored by all of you in terms of inviting me here, Professor Lung, and I'm very honored also that you're here, because today we're going to talk about my favorite topic. So yes, I know my title is Professor of Learning Analytics, but my real hobby is culture. I really love culture. So hopefully we will gonna do some really interesting interactive activities today. So what I will do is, first of all, what is culture? Then I'm going to specifically focus on Hofstede's definition of culture, and we're going to do an interactive exercise. And we're going to do this interactive exercise. I've never done this, so it might work, it might not work. So let's see. And then I'm going to show you how culture influences learning, and maybe that is beneficial to you. And then lastly, I will go through 17 recommendations, which is a lot, of what you can do as a teacher and a student to improve your learning. So let's go through culture. Is there anyone who knows what culture is? I have no idea what culture is. But do you feel, am I part of your culture? Am I a Hong Kong citizen? No. Am I an Asian person? No. Am I part of your culture? No? So one definition says that the definition of culture is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarding collectivity. So tomorrow the dragon boat races start. If I would join those races, would I become part of your culture? Would I become Hong Kong culture? Yes? It's just one. Yes. I'm still a white person.
It's not a matter of their appearance, it's not a matter of the same color.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what would I need to do to become part of your culture? Yeah. 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 So if I would live for 20 years in Hong Kong and speak Cantonese, would I be part of your culture? Okay. Okay. So another definition is the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. It could be that I live here for 20 years, but still I'm not really familiar with the customs. And you could probably pick upon that, right? And there is a third definition which is a little bit provocative, but it's of the leading culture scientist Geert Hofstede, who is by mere chance a Dutchman. I do apologize for this. He's from the same country as I'm from my same culture. And he calls it the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes members from one group to another. And this collective programming sounds very negative, but that programming starts from the day you're born. From the day that you're born, your parents give you certain values and norms. And your parents are being influenced by their parents and the society and the way how they were raised. Once you become a little bit older, you go to school. And school is the biggest cultural influencer of your identity. How I go to school, the school that I was taught, influences why I eventually became Dutch. And it took me a long time to equate myself, yes, I'm Dutch. And I will share a personal story later. But it is a kind of collective programming of the mind. And people who go through similar experiences, they will say, yes, I am Dutch. When I go to the UK, when I go back home, many people don't recognize that I'm Dutch. They will say because of my accent. No, they think because I'm white. I am from the UK. But only after a couple of minutes I realize I'm actually not from the UK because I do things slightly different. So it's this collective programming which you can mimic, but it is difficult. So in a nice visualization, culture is more than language, it's more than customs, it's more than rituals, it's about behavior, it might be about faith, it might be the food that you eat, it's about all these things interlinked. And it's quite difficult to distinguish where the boundaries start and where the boundaries stop. So let me give you an example. Let's talk about where I'm from. So this is a map of the Netherlands, and I was raised here. And if you look very carefully, there is no physical connection to the rest of the Netherlands. Actually, the only connection is to the Belgian part. So I'm in a part of the Netherlands which technically is an island, because I'm not physically connected to the Netherlands. But my parents came from a different region, or 2 hours drive this is. And when you would interview a farmer in Maastricht, he would speak a dialect that a person from here would not understand. It's even a small country like the Netherlands, people have different dialects. So eventually, when I went and was born, and I went to kindergarten, I was beaten up, seriously, because I spoke an accent from my parents, which no one understood. But it's still the Netherlands, it's a small country, how is that possible? So do we have a common culture, or is our culture the same? You could argue, well, maybe we're not the same culture because I speak with a different accent. But eventually I decided to study in Maastricht, at Maastricht University. But because the rents were very expensive, I decided to live in Belgium. So a different country, with a different accent, with a different language. And in fact, if you would draw a map of the languages in the Benelux, so I was raised here in Terneuzen, which is part of a dialect which has more in common with Belgium. And the Dutch language is a different language. When I went to Maastricht, we spoke so-called Limburgian, which is again different from Dutch culture. If I cycled 5 kilometers south, the people spoke French. If I cycled 30 kilometers the other way, to the east, people spoke German. So which culture do I belong to? Right, it's quite interesting. So even in a small space, you could have large cultural language difference, but also large cultural difference in general. So when I studied in Maastricht, we had to also study and live abroad. So I decided my first choice was the US. I didn't get that. So my second choice was allowed, which was I went to Lund University. Which language do they speak in Sweden? Swedish, yes. So I had to learn another language, and I had to learn that Swedish people are very different, even though this is just 1,000 kilometers. And yes, they are also mostly white and blonde. They have a very different culture than the culture where I'm from. And then I met a German girl, and she studied in Heidelberg. So when I went back to the Netherlands to finish my master, I developed a relationship with a German woman, and I started to speak. Which language did I start to speak? German, yes. So I traveled for 5 years back and forth. Then she dumped me, sorry. And I went back to Maastricht. And then I met my lovely wife, Katie, who some of you have seen. And then I traveled to the UK, initially to Brighton. So what language do people in the UK speak? What do people speak in the UK? What language? English, a form of English. And currently I'm here. So it's just a metaphor of you might see a Dutch person in front of you, or you might see a UK person in front of you, but I've lived longer abroad then I've lived in the Netherlands. And even if I lived in the Netherlands, I lived in a part where they don't speak Dutch. And my parents came from a region where they also don't speak Dutch. So what, am I Dutch? I don't know. So what I would like to do, and this is I think what highlights my team, I always hire people from all across the globe. I always hire the best people because it's great to work with people from different backgrounds. And this is, every year we go with the PhD students to a writing camp in the Peak District. And one of the best ways we can learn from people from different cultures is by having dinner together. So every lunch and every dinner, people have to cook, whether it's Italian, Japanese, Korean, Dutch food. And it's great because if you are in an international community, you are on the one hand more aware of your own identity, but also at the same time you appreciate that we are in a way quite one. So who has heard of the term, who has heard of the guy called Hofstede? Geert Hofstede before? No? Never heard about it? So he was hired in the 70s by this company called IBM. That might ring a bell to some, maybe. IBM was the biggest computer maker in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And then I think they went bankrupt. And then they became a software company. But IBM struggled with one big thing. They had offices across the globe, but they couldn't understand why in one country the management style worked, but in another company, exactly the same office, the management style didn't work. So they hired him in the 70s to say, maybe you could do a survey to understand why the management style, let's say in Korea, seems to work, but not in China, or why the management style in Japan doesn't work, but for example in Indonesia did. So what he did, he surveyed 50,000 people at IBM. That was the size of the company in these 50 countries. And he came up with these 5 notions, which eventually became 6. And I will discuss this with you in an interactive exercise. What he found was that countries differ in power distance, countries differ in individualism versus collectivism, countries differ in masculinity versus femininity, countries differ in terms of uncertainty avoidance, and countries differ between long-term and short-term orientation. And then he later added the 6th one, which is indulgence versus restraint. So what he tried to do is to put a numerical value on culture. And you can critically debate whether that's a good thing or not. And what I would like to do now with you as an interactive exercise is to test his approach, to see, in a way, is he right or is he not right? So to get a gut feeling. So what I will do, and you'll see this in a minute, I would like you to come in the front in a minute, and I'm just going to make a big step here. I'm going to make another big step here. That's my 3rd, that's my neutral score. This is my high score, and this is my super high score. So you see the markers of the sculpture. So what I would like you to do is to all stand up, please, and all come to the front. So there's no right and wrong. Just come all to the front. So you have to not worry about what your colleagues are choosing. You just have to think about, how do I view my own identity, my own culture, right? There's no right and wrong. So what I'm asking you to do is, and this is the first one, this is so-called power distance. So power distance expresses the degree to which less powerful members in society accept and expect that powers are distributed unequally. The fundamental issue here is how society handles inequalities among people. And in certain countries, there is a low power distance. So in a low power distance environment, the queen or the king of a country is as important as the cleaner, right? Or if you are a professor or a student, we're all humans, right? So if you believe that that's the reflection of your country, you stand here on the low dimension, right? Or if you think, well, that's partially the case in my country, I think I'm going to stand here. Or if you think, well, it's a little bit neutral, I'm going to stand here. Or if you think that in your cultural context, there's actually a high difference between power. So a professor is different from a lecturer, or a boss in a company is different from a cleaner. In other words, when there is a high power distance, you think, okay, I accept that there's a hierarchical order and everyone has a place in society, and I don't need to further justify this. If you think that's the case, you stand here. You see what I'm trying to do? Yes, so go and stand where you think your culture is positioned. Yes?
Is it my perception of the culture that I'm in, instead of my personal, individual?
No, it's about the perception of the... Very good question. It's not about whether you think it should be here. I personally think it should be here. It's about what you think the culture in your particular context is. So what you think...
That's my understanding of the culture that's sort of I belong to.
Yeah, and I don't know which culture you belong to, but basically what you think is the norm in your country. So go ahead and choose and stand wherever you're going to stand. So again, there's no right and wrong. I'm not going to judge you. It's just a funny game. Okay, so most of you are standing either in a neutral zone or slightly more higher power distance. If I take my Netherlands flag on, I would probably stand somewhere here, right? Okay, so let's have a look how Hofstede actually did this. So what I've done is I've listed all the countries that I've lived, and I've added Hong Kong, which I've now lived for 4 weeks, and China. So it seems that if you are from China or from Hong Kong, you have a relatively high power distance, right? You agree? Okay. And there's no right and wrong. I mean, the fact that, for example, when I lived in Sweden, Sweden has one of the lowest power distance, so everyone is equal. You say hi to the king. But that's just the way how that society is set up. And if you look at a map of the world, most countries have a quite high power distance, and there are only a very few countries, mostly Nordic, Scandinavia, and the US, and Australia, that has this relatively low power distance. Okay, let's go to the next question. So reassess yourself. You can stand wherever you want. The next question is about individualism versus collectivism. So individualism and versus signals the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups, from loose ties between individuals to everyone being accepted to look after themselves and the immediate family, to being integrated into strong, cohesive groups. So if you think that your culture is identified as individualism, you go and stand here. I prefer loosely knit social framework in which individuals are expected to take care of themselves and their immediate family, but that's it. If you think your culture is collectivist, you go and stand there. So, well, let's see what happens. So some of you are moving, which is interesting. But most of you are more or less staying at the same place, right? Does anyone want to share why you're moving or why you're not moving? Okay, it's fine. Let's just play the game a little bit more. So you're indeed right that in China and Hong Kong, the individualism scores are relatively low according to Hofstede. So the collectivist notion of you apparently like to work in cohesive groups, that's part of who you are. Well, for example, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, I mean, I call my mother once a week and that's it, right? And I have hardly any contact with my family because that's how it's accepted in the Netherlands. But similarly, for example, in Germany or in the UK, it's very individualistic. Yeah? And you can see a kind of interesting divide if you look at the world. There are some countries that are even more, I mean, the whites basically are where there's no data, so it doesn't mean that they're super collectivist, but it is interesting that there's this strong area in Asia which is relatively collectivist, which you probably know. Okay, the next one. Masculinity versus femininity. This is not whether you're emancipated or not, but this is about what society thinks is a common role. So in a masculine society, you have a society with lots of achievement, heroes, and those who are successful get material rewards. So in a masculine society, the society is very competitive. It's very masculine, like, ooh, you know, like that big ape, yeah. And in a feminine society, it's, well, I prefer cooperation, I prefer modesty, I prefer caring for the weak, I prefer quality of life. So it's much more consensus-oriented. So where do you think your culture is? Is it more masculine or is it more feminine? Okay, so some people are starting to move. Some people haven't moved yet, which could happen. That's fine. I mean, this is your interpretation of culture. You have lived in your culture for years, so you know what is expected or what is not expected. I would say I am somewhere here. So it's nice to stand next to you. So what is perhaps surprising for you, but in the models, China and Hong Kong are quite strong on masculinity. The Sweden and the Netherlands are very feminine countries, very equal countries, while in the UK has a similar, even higher masculinity score than Hong Kong. So it's not about right and wrong. It's about, okay, what do you perceive? What are cultures that is accepted? So if you go to the UK, you often see sportsmen being depicted, but hardly sportswomen. So, for example, the US is also very masculine. Australia is very masculine. But there are some countries, like the Nordic countries here, that are less masculine. Okay. A very difficult question. Uncertainty avoidance. So it's basically about your tolerance of uncertainty. So how do you deal with the fact that perhaps the future can never be known? How do you go about your daily business while maybe the world is going to end tomorrow, or maybe it's going to end in 5 minutes, or maybe you get that amazing grant, or maybe not? How do you deal with that? So there's some people who try to avoid uncertainty by using rigid codes, by having very clear beliefs about what is expected in terms of behavior. They're very intolerant to different ideas because they want to keep control over this uncertainty. And there are others who are like, well, you know, if a meteorite falls on this building, I had a very good life. So I'm accepting of uncertainty. So where would you place yourself? Yes, sorry, society. Yeah, society. Sorry. Oh, that's interesting. So you're moving slightly more to the right, slightly more to uncertainty avoidance. I'm probably somewhere here in the Netherlands. So I quite like to get an insurance if a meteorite falls on my head, and maybe I can see the weather forecast to see when the meteorites are coming. So indeed, China and Hong Kong people tend to have quite good acceptance of uncertainty. If things happen, they happen. While in particularly in Germany and Belgium, we timetable for everything. We try to organize everything. And quite to our surprise, the UK doesn't like the Chinese. They don't really worry about this. Is perhaps with Brexit, they eventually will be solved. That's what some people might think. So again, the colors of the map change. And there are countries like, for example, Russia, that have a very high intolerance of uncertainty, or Spain and France, or the Latin American countries. And 2 more to go, and then we hopefully have a pretty good idea of what we've been doing. So this is long-term versus short-term. So the long-term vision is, I prefer to take a pragmatic approach. I encourage thrift and efforts in a modern education as a way to prepare for the future. So you basically see, oh yes, my society is happy to change. While others might take a short-term view, I prefer to maintain time-honored traditions and norms while viewing societal change with suspicion. So this is a difficult one. So how do you see your society dealing with things in the past? Are things changing as we are at this point in time? So technology is rapidly changing our society. So are we sticking to a kind of, a short-term approach, let's focus on traditions? Or are we focusing, maybe all those technologies could actually be something good? Good luck. Okay, so most of you are staying where you are. It is quite interesting because I think the scores from China and Hong Kong are actually more on this side. So apparently Chinese and Hong Kong response, these are thousands of participants, they quite like this kind of pragmatic change, which might go against some of your perhaps intuitions, while in particular Swedish people and UK people have relatively lower tolerance to this kind of change. And last but not least, I'm going to ask about indulgence versus restraint. Indulgence is not about thinking, I want to drink this as soon as possible. It's about how do you satisfy your needs? So indulgent societies, they basically allow for lots of basic gratification. So if I want to jump, that is accepted. If I want to, walk around in a bathing suit, that's perfectly acceptable. I can do whatever I want. Or maybe your country, your culture is about restraint. It's about suppressing those needs. Maybe I would like to go for a beer, but I'm not going to drink it now. I'm going to wait maybe until I come home or when I've achieved something. So where would you position yourself and your culture? It's suddenly a big move. Okay. So you're on the restraint, you think. Okay. And that apparently is the case. Apparently Swedish people are the people who most indulge themselves. And I've lived in Sweden for 2 years, and they definitely know how to party. So the question which I'm basically asking is, so if you put everything together, right, from power, distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty, avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence, do you recognize yourself in these pictures, knowing the culture where you're from? Is it an accurate depiction? There's no right and wrong, as you've seen, right? Cultures are... Yeah?
My understanding of my culture, which I would presume to be the Chinese culture in general, sort of, I'm not sure whether this is a sort of in line with the overall understanding, and I'm not sure whether my perception is the same as other people's perception. But and that's why in the previous exercise, I was just trying as best as I could to use my understanding of what traditional Chinese culture is about and to move around according to your instruction.
Yeah, but what is quite interesting, if we would have put a chip in each of you, or if we would have tracked where you're standing, it seems that you're very closely following each other's movements. Yes, there are a couple of people who are slightly more on the outside, and slightly some people moved a little bit more, but there seems to be this kind of invisible understanding of what Chinese culture is. Is that right, or is that not right? Okay, yeah. But it is fascinating because it's this collective programming of the mind. If the class would be very heterogeneous in terms of people from China, from Sweden, from the US, you probably will see that slightly more differences. But it's fascinating that, and there's maybe a little bit of peer pressure. If everyone moves to this direction, you might think, oh, I maybe have to move also to that direction. So in a way, I'm influencing you. But it's quite fascinating to see. So when I was reflecting on this, I didn't know what to expect, but I was reflecting this myself. I was expecting some strong similar patterns, and there seem to be very strong similar patterns in the way that Hofstede predicted. But at the same time, and that's also where you can see where you're standing, there is a lot of variability. Not everyone has the same definition of culture or perceives it in the way that it's the same. And I think the biggest critique of Hofstede is that it's a super oversimplified narrative. Probably there is as much variation within this as there is between the different notions. So if I would talk to each of you individually, how willing are you to accept power distance? Maybe you might say, I hate hierarchy differences. And you might say, well, I think that's part of the... So it's not just because you're from a Chinese background that everyone believes this, but it's fascinating. Does anyone else want to comment on this model of culture? Anyone? Did you enjoy this? Was it interesting? Yeah, it is surprising that this collective programming of the mind, it's very weird to think about is that you are influenced by your culture. It doesn't determine who you are, but it partially influences who you are. So thank you very much. Go and have a sit and make yourself feel comfortable. Thank you. Can I, by the way, offer anyone a tea? No? Yes? No? Or some other? I don't know what this is. What is this? Sorry?
Soy milk.
Sorry?
Soy milk.
Oh, soya milk. Okay, yeah, because me as a foreigner, I have no idea what this is. And I always try different things, so I will try this tonight. Thank you for that. So you might wonder, who cares, right? Oh, apparently Dutch people are different from Chinese Hong Kong students, or people. But why would it matter, right? Why would it matter for learning? One thing why it would matter, and I will make all the slides available to Joseph, so you don't have to write down any of the notes. He will share them afterwards with you. Is that if I put into brackets international students could be mainland China students coming to Hong Kong, or I don't know, Belgian students coming to the Netherlands, or German students coming to the Netherlands. They will perhaps when they go to the host institution, they might experience a so-called culture shock, where they realize that the kind of behavior that is expected in the host institution is very different from what they're expecting in their own institution. And I will show you a couple of examples later. So, of course, every student will go through a culture shock. If you go from secondary education to university, you will have to learn in a different way. But for international students, this shock might even be bigger. And De Vita called this a so-called cultural learning style. And there he basically was saying it proposes learning as a culturally based phenomenon, which may explain why teaching methods in one context work well, but while other teaching methods might not work in other settings. So we were just discussing with Professor Leung how many international students come to the United Kingdom. And in certain business degree programs, 50% of the students are from abroad. And these might be really successful students that if they opted to go to their home country might be super successful. But when they come to the UK, they realize, oh, you're expected to teach in a particular way, you're expected to study in a particular way, and perhaps the teaching style doesn't fit with your needs. So this doesn't say that the student is not a good student, it just means that this teaching style is not appropriate for that student. And what Colleen Ward found was that the so-called psychological and sociocultural adjustment for international students was easier if the distance between where a student is from and where they're studying is smaller. So if you come from mainland China and you live 20 miles away from Hong Kong, you probably have a smaller distance to make in terms of system than if you are from Dongbei, for example, or if you come from Russia, or if you come even from the Netherlands and go and study here. And Babika called this so-called cultural distance. So even if you come from different cultures, if you are relatively similar, you might experience similar experiences. And then an interesting thing happens, and that's why I'm so interested in culture. This is this notion of acculturation. So I'm slowly starting to feel at home in Hong Kong. I now know that this is soya milk, and I've been looking for soya milk, so I can perhaps next time go to the shop and actually buy this. So I'm also getting more familiar with the rituals. So typically international students, when they move somewhere else, they become a little bit like the local people, a little bit. But often this cultural change is mostly coming from the people who come to the new organization or come to the new culture. So I think you probably will experience this here as well. If there are only a couple of students from mainland China, they are expected to adjust to the Hong Kong education situation. If there are lots of mainland China students, then the Hong Kong students might be expected to adjust. So who is from mainland China? Is everyone from Hong Kong? Yes? Okay. But what eventually will happen is the dominant culture is dependent on basically whoever is in your environment, which is quite interesting. But irrespective of who is in your classroom, you eventually will have to learn to work together with people from different cultures, because when you work in companies, and Professor Leung was saying, well, you were in Canada before, you have to eventually learn to work with people who are different from you. And studying with people from a different background is quite interesting and rewarding. But obviously, international students may not be aware of the customs. So when I first started to teach here, normally when I teach and I ask a question, I get 2-3 people to raise their hand, and then eventually everyone contributes. So that didn't happen the first time I taught here, and there was not really a debate with my students. So I was thinking, maybe I'm a bad teacher. Maybe I don't understand the culture. And then I was reflecting on it, well, maybe the style of teaching I'm giving is not what you're expecting from me. So what I'm trying to say is my awareness of explicit and implicit customs and cultures of when you're working somewhere else, those are very difficult to gauge. And it might take some while to understand. And in particular, when you come from a different background, so I come from a Western background to a non-Western Asian background, it will take me some time to get used to this kind of way of interaction and teaching. But it has fundamental implications for learning. So, for example, in Germany or Japan, which score very high on power distance, education is characterized by competition. So in Germany and Japan, the best students are the hardest working students, and everyone is striving to be the best student. So if you study in those countries, you want to be the best, and I see you nodding. This is the kind of expectation you have, perhaps. But for example, if you study in the Netherlands, or if you study in the Swedish countries like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, we actually don't like that. The teachers are saying, well, the average student is the norm. I remember when I was teaching in the Netherlands and I got students who got a grade of 60 out of 100. And I was like, yeah, you could do so much better. And he's like, why would I? 60 is good enough. And I was always really mad that students didn't want to work harder. But they said, well, why? Then I have more time to party, or I have more time to do other things. While in Germany or in Japan, if you would get 60 out of 100, that might be considered to be a failure. So it is really interesting that these cultural expectations play an influence in terms of how you are learning. And sometimes, for example, in the Netherlands or in Sweden, if you get a 60, that's not a problem, because you can probably learn a lot from that. While I've heard there's a lot of pressure on you and on students to get to these high levels, so if you get a low grade, it immediately has a negative influence on you. And maybe your parents start to say you have to study more, maybe you have to take extra lessons. So the way how your culture programs you influences what you're doing as a student, which is kind of interesting. So this is the link between culture and learning, right? So the next step is I'm going to show you two practical cases. So are there any questions before I go to the practical cases? Are you still with me? Yeah? Are you still enjoying it? Yeah? Cool. So in this practical case study, this was done with my partner in crime. He's an econometrician. We wanted to identify, okay, so how do these cultural dimensions actually influence international, and in this case, local Dutch students, on how well they are academically adjusted, how well they're socially adjusted, and how well they're performing in the Netherlands. So this is again in the Netherlands, not in Japan. So this is a cultural context. So in this cultural context, the Netherlands is highlighted as a super individualistic but feminine country. We are highly egalitarian. That means everyone is equal. It's a different kind of equal to the kind of collective system, because we are individualistic, but everyone is the same. So no one would call me Professor Rienties. They would just call me Bart. If my students come to me, they don't even ask, oh, thank you for coming. They would say, hey, Bart, can you help me with this problem? This would perhaps not happen here. So the teacher is very approachable, and most of the teaching is done in a so-called student-centered way. So we don't have lectures like this very often. We mostly work in small groups. So that's the way that we design courses in the Netherlands. So in total, 9 universities participated, And all these universities have extensive induction programs for students who come from abroad. So, for example, we have buddies, we have coaches, we have online summer courses. So we were basically interested, if these international students come to these 9 universities, which international students are more successful in terms of academic and social adjustment, and which students do well in terms of performance. So we used a psychometric questionnaire amongst 2,500 students, and we included 23 different programs, from business to marketing, engineering to science. So these were the students that we included in our data set. So, for example, 19 students from the US, and we had 93 students from so-called Confucian Asian countries. So Confucian Asian by Hofstede, by this clustering of these 6 different scores, although you can't say that Taiwan, Vietnam, and China are exactly the same, they have more similarities between each other than, for example, Latin America. And thus they are clustered together as a similar geocultural region, as Hofstede would call this. So let's have a look. Or maybe before we do you think that this culture makes a difference in terms of how students are performing or not? Yeah? Okay, we all think it makes a difference. Okay? So this is a slightly complicated graph, so I have to explain this. So the baseline, 0, are the Dutch students. And then we compare the Dutch students, the local students, versus all the other students. So if we, for example, look at German students, they don't differ in terms of academic adjustment, and they don't differ in terms of social adjustment. But in terms of personal emotional adjustment, the extent to which they feel stressed or whether they feel comfortable studying, they have a significantly lower score. So they are more stressed relative to Dutch students. But at the same time, they have a slightly, this is probably not significant, slightly more attachment. They feel attached to the university, and they have a much more positive image of the university than Dutch students. And they're slightly less satisfied. So if we look at the Confucian Asian students, nearly all the scores are lower relative to the Dutch students. So they are slightly less academically adjusted, they have slightly lower social adjustment scores, they feel substantially more stressed after 6 to 8 months of studying, which we know is this kind of culture shock. And in particular, they have suddenly a much smaller, much more negative attachment towards the institute, so they feel much less part of the institute, and are also significantly less satisfied with the experience. So again, this could be amazing students, but they decided to come to the Netherlands, and then they realized that, okay, the culture that they are in suddenly doesn't really fit with the culture they're expected to work with in the Netherlands. And this could partly be due to the fact that in the Netherlands you have to work in small groups, you have to do presentations, and that's perhaps what you're not, perhaps that was not what you were initially expecting. So then we looked at, okay, what does actually predict performance in terms of average grades and the number of credits? And what we found, if we look at the cultural dimensions, people with high power distance, so those are students where there's a large difference between power and those who don't have power. So all the students who were standing here, remember the first exercise I did, they seem to have a negative effect, a negative predictor on GPA relative to other students. And similarly, which is perhaps not really surprising, students who come from masculine countries, so where there's a lot of masculinity, so performance focusing on good grades, those did much better than students from feminine countries like the Netherlands or Sweden. We didn't see any effect in terms of credits, so it's just the grades that were different. And then we found that students in general, irrespective of culture, who were more academically adjusted, were more likely to get good grades. So you could, in a very extreme setting, you could come from Latin America, feel very uncomfortable with the context in which you're studying in a different language, but it could still be, if you're academically adjusted, you could adjust over time and feel more comfortable and eventually do well. So I think what I've tried to show you in a way is that culture could have a significant influence on adjustment processes. So do these adjustment processes also work the other way around? So when international students come to China, do they experience similar things, or is it only Chinese students who, for example, come to the United Kingdom or the UK? And this is what we try to explore in this book from 2016. So we looked in 14 different countries. We looked at kind of this pattern. So we looked in, does this work in South America, does this work in China? And we were interested to see whether all these complex processes were similar in different countries. So this is work with Kate Zhang from Dufe University. And in China, yes, there's a tremendous increase in internationalization. So more and more students from abroad want to come to China to learn the Chinese culture, to learn the Chinese language. We all know that China is probably already the biggest dominant player in the market. So of course it's good to learn Mandarin and Cantonese. I really feel very bad that I still can't speak a single word, but maybe in 5 years' time I will be fluent. So there's definitely a trend. And what she then did was to see, okay, is there a relation between international students who form relations with Chinese students, and thus making relations, friendship relations, positively influence their adjustment and positively influence their performance? And so she basically did a relatively small study with mostly business management students, and these students were from 24 different countries. So let's have a look. So what she found was, I think, quite interesting. What she found was students who had more host national ratio. This sounds really quantitative. In plain English, this means if you have more Chinese friends relative to international friends, your host national ratio will go up. If you have no Chinese friends, you have a low host national ratio. If you have lots of Chinese friends, your host national ratio will go up, right? So what she found was that students, international students who had lots of Chinese friends, were better adjusted over time, which is in line with lots of acculturation theories. And also, what she found that students, international students who mostly talked with other international students had less adjustment. So if I would study again and I would go to China and I would only mingle with Dutch students, I probably would get a lower academic adjustment over time. Nonetheless, none of these influenced life satisfaction. So all these students were equally happy, irrespective if they had lots of Chinese friends or not. So qualitatively, a slightly different picture emerged. So when we interviewed these students afterwards, when Kate interviewed these, they were basically saying, yeah, they initially received lots of positive reactions from the Chinese students in the local population, but there seems to be a slight misexpectation, perhaps, in terms of why these people were keen to mingle. So, for example, one Turkish lady was, oh no, it's not a Turkish lady, yeah, it was a Turkish lady. She said, well, they were primarily interested to meet other international students because then they could speak in English, and that's the way how they could improve their English. While most international students wanted to go to China to learn Mandarin or Cantonese. So over time, very few international students actually manage to maintain these strong links with co-national students. And this is just a nice quote. So they were saying, well, if you teach me Chinese, I will teach you English. But it is quite difficult to do that in real life. And also what was interesting, and this is basically in line with research I've shown you previously, that most students stick with their own culture. Most students focus on their own groups, is that most of the Chinese were sitting with the Chinese, while mostly of the international students were sitting with the international students. And it was actually quite difficult to develop this kind of cross-cultural dynamic. So yeah, it is difficult. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, when international students come to Europe, they have transition issues. But at the same time, when international students come to Hong Kong, or when they come to China, they also experience similar transition issues, because these cultural differences play a role. So before I go to my 17 recommendations to address this, I'm sure this has given you some thought, because this is perhaps a little bit simplistic, or perhaps a little bit too black and white. So is there anyone who would like to raise a question before I go to my recommendations, or a comment where you say, oh, Bart, this is not right? Anyone? Yeah. Sorry, can I just put you on the mic so that they afterwards can record this?
I agree with the observation that international students, in my case, would be mainland students,
Yeah.
tend to stay together as a group.
Mhm.
And the Hong Kong students, they would stay together as separate groups. So they don't want to mingle when they do the group projects.
Yep.
So I just don't know how to. As a lecturer myself, I find it's very difficult to mix
Yep.
them together.
Yep.
First, the learning experience will be very different. So the Hong Kong students, they are very reluctant to
Yep.
reach out to the international students. International, not just not just mainland students, but students from English-speaking students.
Yeah.
First, because of the language,
Yep.
and they don't want to speak English for Hong Kong students sometimes. They find it more comfortable, easier, as they stay with the same people, so-called
Yep.
same people.
Yeah.
So I agree with such observation
Yeah.
that it does happen in higher education. From my role is that I don't know how I can improve the situation.
Yeah. So we will come up with the recommendations. But the number one thing I always say is you have to force it. And force it, but in a positive way. Because eventually, for example, for Hong Kong students mingling with mainland China students, they will eventually become, mainland China students will become the next business leaders in China, or they will become the next politicians. So if you already during your student time build networks with key people, I mean, I have friends when I studied in Sweden, or I have friends that have studied at Maastricht who are now leading politicians. And the only reason why they contact me is because I proactively work with them. So if you can, it is forcing is perhaps the wrong word, but encouraging them to work together. So what I typically do is, when I have group work, I force people to work with different cultures, because I say you will eventually learn more than if you all are working from the same discipline. And many students complain and come to me afterwards, I don't want to work with so-and-so, and that person doesn't work like that. It's like, but in real life, in companies, you also have to work with people from different cultures. So the more you can practice your skills of working with people from a different culture, the more developed you become as a person. And then you probably will realize that that person has many of the same drives and ambitions as you have. But you're not convinced.
I agree with that, and I think it's part of the insecurities there.
Yeah. And it is difficult, and so one of the things I do is bang them with research. So we have done lots of studies, experimental studies, where we've shown that if you mix students in mixed cultural groups, they perform better in the end. They get higher grades, they get higher scores than students from the same culture. So it's a little bit not only forcing with a bat, but it's also giving that carrot, that if you work together with people from a different culture, you actually learn much more and get better ideas. So it is a tension. So thank you for raising that question. It is really, it's the eternal question. And every time I teach, it's like, oh, I don't want to work with Germans, or I don't want to work with Indians. And I'm like, why not? Why not? Okay. Any other questions? Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? So, if not, I will share you our recommendations. So these recommendations are based by the book that we've written. So with Divya Jindal-Snape, we looked at those 14 different countries, and we basically distilled. So it's not only my recommendations, it's the recommendations by Divya. And let me just tell you an anecdote. She is originally Indian, and she did her PhD in Japan. And Japan is not only a high power distance, but also a very masculine country. So in the first 2 years, that's what she told me, I don't know if that's still the case. In the first 2 years, she was not allowed to speak to the supervisor unless he spoke to her. But also, apparently, and that's what she told me, she was not allowed to leave until he left. And also only in the third year was she allowed to present work without him being present. So it's really interesting, because if she would do her PhD in the Netherlands, I remember very vividly one of my American PhD students came at 6 o'clock, and she said, "Bart, do I have permission to go home?" And I'm like, "I'm from the Netherlands. Why are you asking me to permission to home?" I said, "If you ask that one more time, I will never speak to you. You can just do whatever you want." So it's these cultures influence what you think is right or what you think is wrong. So she has a very interesting, coming back to Divya, she had a very interesting PhD experience. So what can we do to improve this? So there is this difficulty of familiarization of knowledge in a new context. So problems may arise when we talk about familiarity of educational systems. So in particular, cultures that have a high need of uncertainty avoidance, who really want to have strict rules, who really want to have everything really clearly laid out. If I say to them, right, go and build a robot and come back in 5 weeks' time, many students might think this is a really difficult exercise. They want to have very clear rules. What do you mean a robot? What do you mean 5 weeks? What does that robot have to do? And I as a teacher think, well, I don't care, just build it, right? So in certain cultures, some students might not be fully prepared for this particular environment. So what we can do is to develop kind of familiarization with that. So one thing that we have done, the first recommendation, is to provide this information before you even go to the university. So lots of universities are now not only posting lots of interesting flashy pictures of the building, but they're also showing, okay, what is it like to work in small groups? So for example, my university in the Netherlands, it shows you've chosen Maastricht University, but you have to work in small groups. So when students come to Maastricht, they know that they have to work in small groups. And we give examples of what to do to work in small groups. Then we develop, the second recommendation is to develop the so-called intercultural training packages for students for both international and at-home students, so in your case with Hong Kong versus mainland China students, it would actually be quite good to be aware of the differences and talk about this before students actually start or in the first week. And another thing which we recommend is to build peer pairing. So that could be a second-year student monitoring a first-year student, or a third-year student supporting a second-year student, because students who are in later years, they might already have experiences of what works and what doesn't work. And you could think about, for example, those Confucian Asian students coming all the way to the Netherlands, which is a very cold country. If you pair them with another Asian student who has been relatively successful, at least you develop these coping mechanisms. And what we're saying is we need these early interventions. So these early interventions could actually already start as soon as a student starts at the university, but perhaps if you notice that a student is experiencing stress, you shouldn't wait until the first exam. You should actually think, well, maybe we should do this at an earlier stage. Then there's an issue about control and choice. So if you're stressed, you probably have limited capacity to learn. So in a fancy word, this is called cognitive load. If you're very stressed, if you're really worried about your exam, the ability to learn is quite difficult. So what we try to do is to make students, when they come to a different environment, we first want to help them with their daily lives so that they feel settled. I remember very vividly when I came here, Professor Leung said, don't worry about it, just, go and enjoy. We had dinner, so on the first night, so I didn't have to worry about, where am I going to get my next food? And don't worry the first 2 days, come whenever you want. So you're slowly settling in. So, but lots of our international students, they come in the day before the first lecture and they haven't even found the way to the campus. And then on the first day, you're expecting them to give very difficult lectures. So it's about how do you first allow them to settle in and then allow them to learn. The sixth recommendation is about to recognize that every person is different and that some people might be uncomfortable with this uncertainty and ambiguity. So in the UK, for example, we quite often say, well, go and find out this problem in computer science and come back in 6 weeks. Or run an event. This is literally what we said. Your assessment is in one course, run an event, and if it's profitable, you pass. That's the assessment. And many students struggle with this. What do you mean running an event? What do you mean it has to be profitable? And it's like, well, if you want to become an event manager, that's a great assessment, so go ahead and do it. But many students might struggle with this. So what you could do is then help this by linking people with similar cultural backgrounds to develop this early environment. So what we're not saying is always link up with people who are different in terms of culture. It is actually perhaps quite good to initially develop co-national relations, but then slowly start to build more relations with host national students and multinational students and broader communities. So if you don't provide these opportunities to interact, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where you will see that all the Hong Kong students are sitting in one side of the building and all the mainland China students are sitting somewhere else on the table. So you have to also nurture this. Then, of course, there are these individual differences. This is also the kind of exercise we did when you were standing here. The fact that you are from an Asian background doesn't mean you're all the same. You probably have much more differences than you have similarities. So the fact, I meet many teachers who say, the Asians, they're very hard learners, but they don't talk. What do you mean? There's not all Asian students are like this. So what we encourage teachers is to accept that people have multiple identities and that they also need these multiple identities to develop this sense of belonging and acceptance. So previously I've shown you a quote of a student who was part of a Buddhist club, and does she also develop lots of relations with other people? So the fact that she's Asian doesn't mean that she can't connect with other people, but it's about what kind of identities do people build, and also recognize that if you are going to a different country, I mean, I can't speak Cantonese, so it is really difficult for me to adjust here. But when I'm trying to speak Cantonese, encourage me, even if it's full of mistakes. It's like I'm trying to do my best. And this is in particular interesting in a UK context, where in a UK context we're expecting gender to be equal, but this is not always the expectation in other cultures. So in other cultures, people look at the man and say, hey, do you want to speak up on behalf of the group? And teachers might not expect this. They might think, but why can't you have a voice? So it's interesting. In terms of what we can also do as teachers is to, and I think this is really powerful, is to integrate multicultural content into the teaching program. So one way to coming back to your issue with the mingling is we found that in one business degree, most of the examples were coming from the UK. And then the students were saying, but why should I work with Chinese students? Because they have no understanding of Chinese. Of the UK context. So what we then did the year afterwards, we said, okay, the first week is UK, the second week is China, the third week is India, the fourth week is Germany, and then the fifth week they had to write a cross-institutional case of all five. So then you needed to have those people from different cultures, otherwise you couldn't solve the task. So it's about being aware that the examples you use, maybe you should use not only Hong Kong examples, but also mainland China examples, for example, use examples from the Netherlands. This we talked about before, putting students into groups. And one of the things we noticed, if you have a group of 5, because we always encourage unequal groups, so it's either 5, 3, 7. The reason why we do this is that there's then always an opportunity for a decision. If you have 4, it can be 2 against 2. And so we always encourage uneven group numbers. And what we notice, if you have only one co-national student in that group, let's say 1 Chinese and 4 English, the co-national student will feel very lonely. So what we typically do is try to mix it with 2 of each. Right, last 3. Of course, these international students are not the only ones who are experiencing these decisions. Local students, staff, and the communities at large will also experience these multiple transitions of their own, and some might be triggered by this arrival of local students. I went yesterday to the 7-Eleven and I wanted to get a receipt, but the lady in the cash register didn't speak English and I didn't speak Cantonese. So I had an interaction with her and I explained it 2 or 3 times, receipt, ticket, I came up with written down, and she always gave me a bag because she thought I was looking for a bag and not for a receipt. But it's really interesting that this process of acculturation is always 2 ways. It's about me not understanding Cantonese, but also her not understanding English. So when you have international students on your campus, this has an influence on everyone around you. And not only will this have an influence on the students themselves will probably also have lots of people around them. I had many international students coming to my office who were crying, saying, not due to me, but they were, my family from Botswana has paid, the entire village has chipped in for me to come to the UK, and now I got a very low grade, and I'm so ashamed that I have this low grade. What do? I can't go back to my family. she would be from the Netherlands, she would say, well, you have a low grade, who cares? You know, that's your problem. You know, you have to work a little bit harder. But so you have to be really mindful that when you're meeting that person, it's not only that person, but it's the entire cultural context and the family around them that has these influences. So one way to address this is to think about, okay, when you have that Botswanan student in and you can't really solve that problem when you're meeting her one-to-one, is to think about, is there anyone else from Botswana that I know that could potentially help? Or is there anyone that I could help so that she could build that confidence? Or maybe there is a Botswanan support network that I could put her into touch with, so that you develop the support structure so that she's not alone. And last but not least is, I think this is really important, it's about the training of not only the international students and the host students, but it's a training of everyone, from the catering to all the way the vice chancellor, that it is not easy to study in a different country. And even if you have the best, most brightest students, there could be very big cultural adjustment issues. So those were my 17 recommendations. And I'm hoping for a fantastic cross-cultural experience that you might have in your life. And if there are any questions, do feel free to come after this session. And thank you for coming.